Welcome to La Taverna Friuli podcast, the definitive podcast on the wines of Friuli Venezia Giulia. I'm your host, Wayne Young. Join me here each week for casual conversations with wine people and other characters from the undiscovered region of Friuli Venezia Giulia in northeastern Italy. Hey, Friuli wine friends, welcome back to La Taverna, and I am Wayne Young, your host, back here with this second part of a conversation with journalist Robert Draper. Robert works for the New York Times, but he has written a few articles about Friuli and Friulian wine, Trieste. He's also a huge fan of Friulian culture, Friulian wine, and in this second part of the conversation, we talk a little bit about the evolution of Friulian wineries. We talk about natural wine. We get into a bunch of different things. So without any further ado, let's get into this second part of this conversation with journalist Robert Draper. So there's a real sense of understanding what you love to do and concentrating on that, and not necessarily amassing wealth and becoming bigger and more powerful.
No, I mean, I think that, you and I both know a total of, I don't know, maybe 8 wineries among the hundreds in Friuli where you can say the people are wealthy. Right. And there may be, roughly that amount. And a couple of those, I should add, haven't come to a happy end. Did they, in their effort to expand, a new generation will then get a hold of the winery, won't know what to do with it, and will ultimately sell it to somebody.
Or they'll overextend and they're not able to sort of, not able to
maintain the quality. And that's right. Now, the downside to ethos, as I described it, is that they're not the world's best promoters, and so many of the great Friuli winemakers don't even have a U.S. importer. I mean, a significant majority, if not a vast majority, of the best wines in Friuli simply cannot be found anywhere in America.
Wow.
And what that means is that, but these are not guys who are stuck with a vintage of wine, half of which is just sitting there and they end up drinking it themselves. No, they sell out, but they sell in Italy, they sell in Austria, and then they may sell to some other markets, Germany or Japan, and somewhat to the U.S. But most of all, they're small. They're small wineries, and their production is minuscule by American standards, but it's just enough for them to live a good life with the people they love.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I think that's important. Yeah, there's always this contrast made between Friulian winemakers and Veneto winemakers, right? So we're talking, the commercial successes of Valpolicella and Prosecco.
Yes, right.
And everybody, even the Friulani themselves, say the Veneti are a different breed. They're commercianti. They're businessmen. They understand the idea of business. And somebody, explained it to me one time that, basically you had a period of time when there was an influx of government money that came here that allowed these men who were basically farmers to become great winemakers, and they just knew how to make wine, but they didn't know how to sell it. So, your observation about not being the best promoters is right on target.
Well, and it's a double-edged sword, of course. And look, to the westmost part of the region, as the part that borders Veneto is the one that's increasingly susceptible to those kinds of trends from Veneto in terms of pulling out all of the native grapes and growing, and making Prosecco instead. But just as the Friulani will derisively refer to the Veneti as, people obsessed with business, the Veneti in turn always called the Friulani backwards and stubborn and parochial, and Sure, that's certainly one way to look at it, but they're not completely stuck in the past by any means. As you know, so many of the winemakers come from an agrarian tradition, meaning their great grandfathers and grandfathers and fathers grew grapes. Some of them never made wine, some of them did, but the ones that did make wine tended to be bulk wine, vino sfuso, and it was then the sons who said to the fathers and the grandfathers, I think we should make high quality wine, which, among other things, involves not using every single grape, but instead doing this really rigorous pruning so that we'll increase intensity and flavor in the wines. And the fathers and grandfathers would express horror seeing unused grapes, saying that's stuff you could drink. Lying fallow there, and so there's plenty of boldness and even shrewdness that accompanies the passing of the torch of the winemaking traditions, and plenty of evolution. But what hasn't happened is a great overreach, at least for the most part, hasn't. A great overreach where people are producing more than they can really maintain the quality. I think there's a real healthy, competitiveness that you see in Friuli. That can be it can be amusing to an outsider who will come in to like the Enoteca in Cormons and to have local winemakers pour you their wines. And in the moment one of the winemakers excuses themselves to go have a cigarette outside or something, the others will say, that his wine's not as good as their wine or something. I mean,
Yeah.
they can be a little catty, but
Yeah.
but that's how they, but that competition, I really do believe, breeds excellence, and in a way that possibly diluting excellence by embracing expansionism is a pitfall that other regions have, that we've seen other regions dabble in, and which Friuli has not, by and large.
I totally agree. How about some personal experiences for you? You've been here lots of times. You've stayed here for many months, even at a time. What are basically some kind of core memories for you as far as, visiting, tasting, parties, winemakers, something really amazing that sticks in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, most of them are kind of early memories, but one of them that to me, is so meaningful is that when I first started coming to Friuli, as I mentioned, I was working on a novel at the time. I was writing for Texas Monthly, and then about like a year after that first visit, I left Texas Monthly for GQ. But to the Cormonesi, the winemakers from Cormons, who I would often see in the Cormons Enoteca, I was viewed as kind of a dilettante, because this American dude who's constantly showing up and says he's a journalist, but they haven't seen anything that I've written. And then a decade later, I published a biography of President George W. Bush. And because of the access that I had received to Bush and to others in the White House, the book was extremely successful and got a lot of attention throughout the world. And so when I remember not long after that book was published, going back to the Cormons Enoteca, and these winemakers had always been nice to me. I think, maybe they viewed me as a dilettante. It didn't bother me any. I kind of was in a way. But one by one, and in particular, Dario Riccaro, who is this really brilliant Bianchista, makes a wonderful Malvasia, among other great white wines, including a great Friulano, came to me and said, I misread you. He's said all this in Italian. I now see that you're a serious journalist, and he began to talk to me on a different level from that I'd been before, and let me into his life more, and would have me over to his winery, and we'd talk. And Roberto Picek, another winemaker from the Cormons area, was the same way. And I just began to get to know these guys better, because they really sort of insisted upon it. The Friulani are known to be, you see this in various places throughout Italy. They can be, they're friendly to people, but are a bit closed, a bit chiuso, and until they feel a kind of, not so much safety, but um, a, a sense that you're there for the right reasons, and
Okay,
that
I like that.
and yeah, and that your curiosity isn't just dilettantism, but is is fervent, and is sincere. And so they began to see me on that level, and it was around that, But even before that, I think I mentioned to you before that, I had an epic day with the great, somewhat eccentric artist winemaker Josko Gravner,
Okay.
who by way of introducing me to himself, picked me up and drove me directly across the border into Slovenia and to the grave site of his grandmother as a
Wow.
kind of establishing shot to make me understand who he was. And so it was, it was being invited into the complexity of their world beyond just the here, have a glass, that has been consistently rewarding to me. And I do have to say that, like, for me, the it is that complex history that makes Friuli stand apart from other regions in Italy. The fact that it was fought over in world wars, and the border within Friuli changed on multiple occasions, where you get to sense this kind of duality between all of these efforts to divide and still an embrace of territory. I'm not sure I have seen that anywhere else other than perhaps the continent of Africa.
Okay. Wow. What about any horror stories that you could share? Anything? I mean, obviously you don't have to mention names, but any particularly difficult situations that you found yourself in traveling in Friuli or tasting wine in Friuli?
The only one that immediately comes to mind, Wayne, is that I had a Vespa accident in the year
Ooh.
2011, where I had rented one of the Vespas that you can get in Collio, and was puttering along with friends, and a lane of oncoming traffic was closed off. And so the car coming from the opposite direction nearly hit me, and
Ooh.
skidding out of the way, I slid off and into the concrete, and had the guy took me to the Gorizia hospital, where I got about 9 stitches in my head.
Ah, yeah.
And I remember, so they did a perfect job, and it cost me exactly €0 to get sewn up. It did take several hours of just sort of sitting in the hallway before a winemaker friend came in and yelled at the doctors, and they finally got me to see someone. But I have to say that while at the time I thought, this is, the Italian medical healthcare system for you, I've since, most recently, a couple of months ago, like 7 hours in a Washington, D.C. emergency room, waiting to get, I had a kitchen accident and cut off a little piece of my thumb. And it took, 7 hours before they put 7 stitches in my thumb and handed me a bill for $1,500.
There you go.
So you got to put in perspective any of these, less than savory moments in Friuli. They're not so bad in the main.
Yeah, I think we might have talked about that the last time we met, that there's, that lack of background radiation of the fear of healthcare, right? Or fear of going bankrupt because you've gotten sick and you need an operation. It just doesn't exist here.
No, that's right. And part of it is because that the Italians, they don't carry a lot of debt, and they certainly don't carry credit card debt, which is an endemic, problem in the United States. What you hear people complain about more of is that, I mean, the government takes a lot of their money, but the government takes, when you add it all up on the, state and local and federal level, in addition to sales and other taxes, the Americans are not exactly lightly taxed themselves. And then the question becomes, what do you get, for
your money?
For your money. And I won't descend into polemics here as an objective American journalist, but I'll just say that the quality of life, it's hard to see a debate where the Americans come out way ahead of the Italians in the quality of life department.
Well, that's one of the things that I've always said about Friuli in general, Udine in particular. The quality of life, at least as an American who has, moved his life full time for more than 20 years to the city of Udine, the quality of life is not up for debate. It's an extremely high level of quality of life. I own my condominium which I probably wouldn't have been able to do in the United States with an average salary. And, I can go out and have a glass of wine and not have to think that I'm going to pay $25 for a glass instead of maybe
Right.
6 or 7 if I want something really, really snazzy. So,
Right.
and people always ask me, don't you miss New York? And I go, no. I love it here. I do. The quality of life here is very, very good.
Well, and your listeners should know that, especially the non-Italian listeners to know that should know that it's so many things are so much cheaper in Italy, Friuli and elsewhere, like food, for example. When you go to a grocery store, the food is a great deal cheaper and of much, much higher quality. And, we mentioned healthcare before. If you're viewing housing in terms of, square feet or something, you kind of have to start with the fact that in Italy, people don't live in a grandiose way. Even for all of the great cuisine, you don't see these palatial kitchens in people's houses the way you'll see them in the United States, because they're just not showy in that regard. And Italians embrace frugality and are not as prone to commercialistic impulses as Americans are. Madison Avenue is really not a thing in Italy. And so you do have to sort of adjust your perspective when you come to Italy. They place a premium on different things from what we do in the US. But when you make that adjustment, it's hard not to conclude that the Italians are kind of onto something and has been for a very long time. It's not a it's not a novel notion on my part, but almost anyone who visits Italy will come away saying that, and then they may encounter some bit of internal cultural commotion when they have to square their own cultural notions with what with what stands in Italy. But I do think that being happy living in Italy is not a hard thing.
Okay. And how about some pet peeves? Do you have any wine pet peeves? Anything that bugs you about the way people handle wine or the way people don't handle wine? Is there anything that really bugs you, especially, living in the States and seeing how it's used here? Is there anything that peeves you about wine culture in general or about Friulian wine in particular?
Well, let's see, a couple of things that come to mind. I mean, I mentioned, Wayne, that when you go into any Enoteca, any bar in Friuli and ask for a glass of white wine, you will invariably be poured a glass of Friulano. Perhaps they'll pour you a Malvasia or a blend. Whereas in the United States, it will invariably be a Chardonnay or a Sauvignon Blanc. And those are characterized, particularly the Chardonnay, by being very oaky, and the Sauvignon by being anti-oaky, but maybe a little what they call pipi di gatto, with a sort of, strong cat pee flavor or aroma to it. And so I'm continually frustrated in the US by the view that white wines are just, necessarily banal. They are more often than not in the US, but Friuli very much gives the lie to that. Well, the thing that I get concerned about in Friuli with their wine is, we talked earlier about the innovativeness and the desire to continually experiment. The one or at least one of the trends that I've resisted is the very Slovenian tendency to use a lot of oak when it comes to some of the white wines, with the result that they really lose their character. And there are also some, not many, but some red winemakers in Friuli who have leaned into the Amarone style of raisin drying, their grapes, which to me causes them to lose their varietal characteristic. And I mean, these are quibbles really around the margins, because I'd be happy to spend the rest of my days drinking only Friulian wine, both white and red. But and I do, and again, what Americans have, I think, to an extreme degree in uniformity of wines, the Friulians have, the opposite situation with, which is a refusal to be defined and to elevator pitch, what their winemaking style is.
Yeah, there's two things that I wanted to touch on with you with that, because you mentioned a particular style, this use of oak, which had a big peak in Friuli, probably in the 90s, and then it sort of, it waxed and then it waned, and now there are still oak proponents here, but it's less. Do you think that that is a function of kind of immaturity in a winemaking area's development, and that they sort of develop past that? Or do you think that that's just a desire for an international appeal?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I do think that amongst some Friuli winemakers I know, though they're very though they're in love with their territory, they do become curious about the international market and would like to be able to compete with the French, for example. There's one prominent Friuli winemaker I won't name who gave me a couple of his red wines to give to the wine critic Robert Parker, because he clearly, was interested in Parker's opinion. And I never saw Parker, so I drank the wines myself. But I mean, so it's not that they're utterly oblivious to them. Actually, the trend, I should have said, when I was talking about over oaking, the one that really bugs me is the trend towards orange wines, which really in a lot of ways was popularized, or I shouldn't say popularized, it was started by Gravner, and then Stanko Radikon and others in the Oslavia area of the Collio of Friuli. And I do think that, so when you go just across the border into Slovenia and to the capital city, Ljubljana, and you have a glass of white wine, invariably the wine will be macerated. It will be an orange wine. They've fallen hook, line, and sinker for the orange wine craze. And you do see that in certain areas of Italy where they feel like to be on the cutting edge, their wine has to have that tannic quality of a macerated orange wine. It's just Wayne, this could be sort of betraying my own, kind of unsophisticated palate, but I've tended to find those wines to be expressive so much more of the style than of the grape themselves, and thus I tend to reject them with some exceptions. I mean, Roberto Picek from the Prades area of Collio, I think, makes some really wonderful white wines that are macerated, not quite orange. And then there's Gravner, who's in a class of his own. But I could go the rest of my life not drinking any orange wines.
Okay. Well, that makes me happy, because with similar exceptions to you. I've never been a big fan of the orange wine thing, and then the natural wine movement that kind of grew out of that, which I'm
can you
not
help
a
me
big
understand
fan.
that, Wayne? Yeah, Wayne.
Sure.
I mean, we hear that the whole natural wine thing, and who among the excellent Friuli producers makes wine that isn't natural? I mean, to me, that moniker natural is very, very misleading, because it implies that if you don't say naturale on your label, then you're somehow, just, sort of coating your grapes with pesticides or something. I just don't get it.
Yeah, well, I've never gotten it either. And, it's also a really convenient way for you to excuse some pretty hairy flaws in your wines. Just, yeah, but there's no sulfites in this wine. Yeah, but it's completely oxidized, and it smells like old socks. But it's like, yeah, but that's natural. That's that's supposed, I mean, when I remember talking to one of the great exceptions for macerated wine and, quote unquote natural wines would be Damian Podversic. And he said, he's like, I don't make natural wines. He says, wines aren't natural. Nature wants to make vinegar. He was like, we're the ones who have to keep it from becoming vinegar using different techniques and things like sulfites to stop that type of thing. So he says, if you don't use sulfites, you're only going to make vinegar. You're only going to have defects. So, a lot of people tend to confound that spectrum of, okay, macerated wines and then natural wines. And I think macerated wines sort of started with this idea. I mean, I just did a wine dinner with Ales Christiancic from Movia, and his idea of using like a lot of skin contact and using his sparkling wines that are in contact with their lees until you basically open them at home is, I don't want to use a lot of sulfites, and this is one way to combat that usage. But then, that can get out of control, and then it just becomes, I've seen and tasted really, really terrible wines, and they're just sort of excused because, well, it's all natural. So, yeah, there has to be a happy medium. I mean, there are plenty of producers in Oslavia who make macerated Ribolla Gialla that is absolutely great, and there are some that could use a little cleaning up, let's say.
Right. No, I feel like, and yes, Christian Ciccio, who I admire as someone who really put Slovenian wines on the map, is nonetheless guilty, I think, in the way that you just described it, of sort of virtue signaling. I'm not quite sure what the function is beyond the virtue itself. And it reminds me, as a political journalist here in Washington, of when the Democrats took control of the House and promptly issued an edict that in the House of Representatives House office cafeterias that there would no longer be any plastic silverware, but instead it would all be made of wood, and that the straws would no longer be plastic, but would be made of paper. And everyone knew that the flatware or whatever was like unusable. I mean, everyone complained about it, and everyone hated the paper straws because they just kind of mangled in your mouth. And so it failed to serve the very basic function of what these things are supposed to do. And I feel that way often about natural wines, that there's so much more about the intent and about the label than they are really about the achievement and what a wine is supposed to do, which fundamentally is to taste good. And many of the natural wines do not. And conversely, many of the wines that don't go around beating their chests claiming that their natural wines are in every meaningful way natural and also taste great.
Exactly. Yeah, there's a couple of things. I mean, everybody complains about sulfites, but I remember when I was a sommelier and people would say, do you have any wines without sulfites? And I would be like, no. And they were like, well, why don't the wines that we get in Italy have sulfites in them? And I said, because they're not required to contain sulfites on the label. Now they do.
That's right.
But at that point they didn't when I was a sommelier in the 90s. And they were like, oh, really? I was like, yeah, there's not a tank for Italians that doesn't have sulfites and a tank for Americans that has sulfites in it. I said, so do you drink like store-bought orange juice? Yeah, there's way more sulfites in store-bought orange juice than there is in the glass of wine that you're going to have right now. So, and I think there's a lot of misinformation on that too. Oh, sulfites give me a headache. That's not a manifestation of sulfites.
Yeah,
that's a manifestation of drinking too much alcohol.
That's exactly right. But I do think that, Americans are particularly prone to convincing themselves that something is bad for them when it is not. That if they're feeling bad, it must be because of this particular ingredient. When, for decades and centuries even, there's a history in Italy that belies that notion. But sulfites was certainly one of them. And it's now you can maybe make an argument about that with tannins, but usually, you can be maybe more prone to allergies or something like that with, if you drink a tannic wine. But mainly it's that these wines can have a higher alcohol content, and that will produce the effects more than, whatever is causing the tannins.
Well, I think the other thing with natural wine too is because there's a lot of attention paid to extremely large industrial winemakers, and all of these wines that are made in huge bulk and are sold for very, very cheap, and using lots of different sort of chemical trickery to make the wine come out palatable and have a decent shelf life. So I think there was this backlash, right? And maybe it's been too much of a backlash, saying we're going to go completely against this whole style of industrial winemaking, and we're going to make it like they made it back in Roman times, which when they had to actually add like honey and laurel leaves and all different sorts of things into the wine because it was basically vinegar.
Yeah. I mean, that's, again, the fallacy there is that those good old days,
the good old days
really
fallacy.
Were really all that good. And again, I'm calling up images of these very small wineries that I have visited by people who are winemakers who are at their root farmers and small farmers and committed to the land and very much roll with the mandates of the climate and of the soil, hand them. And the idea that somehow what they're doing isn't natural, it's just kind of absurd. It's sort of like going to, farmers markets in Italy. My wife and I bought property in Puglia, and though there's a lot I prefer about Friuli over Puglia. Puglia, which is a southern region, takes a back seat to nowhere in Italy other than maybe Sicily in terms of its farmers markets. And when you see their, these incredible tomatoes or zucchini or almost anything that they grow, nobody is saying, that no farmer is advertising them as organic in the way that they do at the DuPont Circle Farmers Market in Washington, D.C., that's decidedly upmarket place. But, there is simply no technique that they use that would somehow subvert the notion of them being organic. They are organic, but they just don't.
Just a given.
Yeah, they just don't charge the crazy amount of money that Whole Foods or the upmarket farmers markets in the United States do, because again, there's this affluent demographic that has been sold on the virtues of organic. But organic is the house that they call home in so many places in Italy.
Right. So when is the next time you're going to be back in Friuli?
Soon, man. Soon. I mean, I'd say soon. Not soon enough. Really, is the answer. I mean, we're be until October before I'm there. But that's October is when I really would love to go, because it's, to me, it's not only the just after the harvest and but also porcini mushroom season and when the vines look so glorious, and you also are starting to get white truffles coming in over from Croatia, and it's just a glorious time of year. I mean, that along with the spring, obviously. So hoping for October.
Good. Well, that seems to be like your time here in Friuli, coming from your article and talking about you loving the sort of fall colors and stuff here. So,
yeah, no, I mean, I like it. I've been to Friuli, I'm pretty sure every month out of the year by now, but that's certainly, and you may well be right that, without it even being a conscious impulse, that I'm nonetheless, drawn to the Friuli I beheld for the first time on my first visit in October of '96.
Anything that I didn't touch on, Robert, that you wanted to sort of express, or anything that I didn't ask that you would like to explore a little bit before we finish our session here?
The only thing I would say, that really is a reiteration of what you and I have said, but putting a finer point on it, is that Friuli is, Italy has 20 regions, and Friuli is one of the smaller ones. Though very accessible from Venice, and for that matter, with the additional airport of Trieste, despite all that, not many people go to it. But I have brought many dozens of people, of Americans, to Friuli, and I'm sure that you have too. And they swoon over the place, and not because they see it through my eyes, but because their own experience of it is of a place that still feels genuine, does not feel like it has been, that it has adopted a kind of touristic notion of Italy. It's not prone to sloganizing, and maybe that's to its detriment from a marketing standpoint, but it repays any slight challenge that it takes to get to Friuli. Most of all, because the people really are so genuine and so generous. And we have not really mentioned the food, except that, and I will say that I think Friuli takes a backseat to no other region in Italy for superb cuisine.
Totally agree.
Which, yeah. I mean, there are Michelin star restaurants of great repute and also great affordability relative to other Michelin star restaurants throughout the world. But even just the baseline cuisine, is absolutely outstanding, and of course goes splendidly with their exemplary wines.
Just goes to reinforce that whole quality of life argument.
Hell yeah.
Absolutely. Anyway, Robert, thank you so much for taking this time. More than an hour of your time I've taken up. I appreciate it very much. And I can't wait to see you back here again in October.
You will definitely know as soon as I plan my trip. And thanks so much in the meantime for having me on, Wayne. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. All right. Have a great one.
All right. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Hey, thank you for listening here at La Taverna. Make sure you follow us on all the socials. La Taverna Podcast on Instagram, La Taverna Friuli on Facebook. And if you listen on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, it'd be great if you'd leave us a nice 5-star rating. See you next week.